In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the term or title Messiah and what this word encompassed for the Jews. Looking at the claims that Jesus makes throughout his ministry, the primary one that we see him say over and over again throughout his public life is that he is the Messiah. And he is the fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures, the one that the people had been waiting for. And so this was a big claim, and especially as we get into what all this would have meant to the Jews, you'll see that what Jesus is doing here is, it can't be understated. It was a huge claim that Jesus was making. So, in order for us to understand the meaning of the word Messiah, we need to try to go back and understand how the Jews of Jesus' time were thinking about this title. What was coming to mind for them when they heard this term Messiah? And so that's what we're trying to do in this lecture, is for me to help you understand what was going through the minds of the Jews when they talk or when they hear about this messianic figure. So, broadly speaking first, the word Messiah is a Hebrew word, which is what the Old Testament was written in. And the equivalent in Greek, which is what the New Testament is written in, is Christ. And so you'll see these two words come up again over and over as you read the Bible. Interestingly, the word Messiah itself doesn't actually occur in the Old Testament, but the meaning of Messiah is anointed one, and it does come up in the Old Testament roughly about 40 times. Now, in a broad sense, this term Messiah was often meant to refer to kings or prophets, so to people that had authority and influence. Okay, so that's kind of the broad term itself. But what we need to get into is what did it specifically mean to the Jewish people, not just in this broad sense of a vocabulary word, something that you can find in the dictionary, but what was kind of the connotation that came with that word. And for the Jews, it was a lot. So all Jews were aware of and expected for God to send this messianic figure. They knew that this was going to happen because they knew the promises of God that their ancestors had passed down to them. So the ancestors had passed these promises down year after year, telling them of what God had promised to the Jewish people. And then they also had the Old Testament prophecies to look back at that talked about this one who was coming, this messianic figure that was sent by God. And so while the group didn't have a detailed picture of what this Messiah would be like or when he was going to come, they did have some broad expectations that probably almost everyone could agree with. So there were 4 of these expectations, and we're going to look in more detail at these now. First, the Messiah would be the King of the Jews. So the Messiah that came along would be the true king that was anointed by Yahweh or by God. So he would be sent straight from God to rule over the Jewish people. If you remember from the Old Testament, one of the greatest kings of Israel was King David, and he was a man he was said to be after God's own heart. So when the Jews thought of a Messiah, they thought of a figure like David, someone that was an ethnic Jew that would come and be a great king and would rule over the Jewish people and would lead them to God. And you can read some of these kingly expectations in these passages. You can look in Jeremiah 33, Isaiah 9, and Zechariah 9. Second, the Messiah would win a battle over the pagans. So remember that at this time, and this is very important to the culture in the New Testament, that at this time the Jewish people were not independent. They were not governing themselves. So they had returned from exile. We read that in the Old Testament. But they were now being ruled over by Rome. So they're, for the most part, having to live in the way that Romans want them to live. So they had this expectation that when the Messiah came, he would come in and be this underdog that comes in and defeats the Romans or whatever power is ruling over them. So they were hoping that the Messiah at this time, if he came soon, that he would come in and he would win this great battle over the Romans. And if you know anything about that time, the Romans had great military strength. And so they were holding on to hope that this Messiah would come in and defeat basically the biggest military power in the world at that time. But the goal, as it had been basically always, was that the Jews would once again be independent. They would once again be ruling and governing over themselves. Third, there was this expectation that the Messiah would come and rebuild and cleanse the temple. So remember that the temple was at the very center of all Jewish life. It was of the utmost importance to Jews, and not only in a religious sense. It was geographically in the center of Jerusalem, and it was an economic and political hub. So in the Old Testament, the temple is where Yahweh resided, where God resided, and it was the place where people could go to meet God. But at this time, God was no longer residing in the temple, and there were many things happening in and around the temple that were corrupt. So there was a lot going on that definitely was not leading to pure worship within the temple. So the Jews had this expectation and this longing that the Messiah would come and once again cleanse the temple and make it what it was once again during the Old Testament. Finally, there was this expectation that the Messiah would bring God-given peace and justice to the world, not just to the Jewish people, but to the world. So remember that things are generally not going well for the Jews at the beginning of the New Testament. They are oppressed, they feel distant from God, and they're tired of being ruled over by others. And so they had this expectation that the Messiah would come and be the true king that would not only govern over them really well and lead them to God, but would also make things right all around them. So all that had come against, all those world powers that had come against the Jewish people, they had this expectation that they would face judgment when the Messiah came. And the Messiah would create peace in the world, not just amongst the Jewish people, but within the world as a whole. So even though the Jews had experienced a lot of suffering and a lot of political unrest, they held on to this hope that when the Messiah came, a lot of these things would be put to right on a global scale. So now circling back to the fact that Jesus claims to be the Messiah, this was his central claim in his ministry. This is what the people had to decide. Is this Jesus of Nazareth? Is he who he claims to be? Is he truly this messianic figure? Interestingly, Jesus was not the only person to come along and claim to be the Messiah. In fact, there were multiple figures who came, and some being more popular than others, made this claim to be the Messiah. But in the end, they would die, and nothing would happen. And so the Jews were constantly weighing the evidence of the Old Testament and the things going on in the world and saying, okay, is this the guy? Is this who we've been waiting for? And so as Jesus comes along, it's the same thing. They're asking constantly, is this the one? Is this the one we've been holding out for? And so now, as we're reading and studying, we must ask the same question. Do we think that Jesus is the Messiah that he claims to be? His foremost claim throughout his ministry was not that he is God in the flesh, even though that is what Christians affirm to being true. Instead, his most central claim was that he was the Messiah that the people had been waiting for. And so you'll see as we read the Gospels that Jesus doesn't exactly look like the people expected him to. He was constantly surprising them in the things that he did and the things that he said. But what you may just find is that you agree that he is who he claims to be and that there is enough evidence for you to believe that that's the case.